Hi, and thank you for joining me for another video. And friends, this week's Parsha is Shmini. And friends, this is one of those sections in the Torah that actually encompasses virtually every core Judaic principle within it, from religious responsibility, dealing with laws, distinguishing the worthy from the not worthy, and even the emulation of God. And friends, the Parsha begins in the second parak with the famous story of the killing of Nadav and Avihu. Who killed them? Well, God did. Why? Because they disobeyed. It states that they offered something weird to God. In other words, they did and brought what they wanted and not what God asked for. And friends, that's a problem we could even see in our world today, when leaders, in an attempt to decipher the will of God, just end up placing stumbling blocks before the people. Whether you're a rabbi or a pastor, my friends, if you can't make a direct connection, a direct correlation with what you're doing or what you're telling others to do and what God wills in his Torah, perhaps it's time to rethink your theology. And really, this should work as a wake-up call to all religious leaders out there to understand that with such privilege and opportunity comes much responsibility. Responsibility for what? To equip your students for success by confirming your teachings with the Torah first. Because as the pasuk states here in this parsha, among those who approach me, I will be proved holy. In the sight of all the people, I will be honored. Teaching us that those who have the access to the Almighty, the Jews, he will expect more of. And if not, it would not hurt him to make an example out of them, like we just read, that he will use them to instruct the nation so that they may honor him. And we know that when the Almighty speaks to the sons of Aaron, he's really trying to encourage Israel to aspire to higher areas of holiness. And here, right after the death of Nadav and Avihu, is no exception. He reminds us that the reason for this, for all this, as the Parsha states, is so that you could distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the clean and the unclean. And honestly, this is the price of calling yourself a member of Israel. And which is why there is no such thing as a secular member of Israel, contrary to how the rabbis teach it nowadays, because none of this could ever have been forced on anyone. And the main thing that gave these individuals any lasting legacy is that at any time they could have just left and been absorbed by the surrounding nations. But what? They chose to stay. Why? Because they believed that this was the last best hope for humanity, which is not something that religious leaders have in mind when they instruct blindly without considering the real consequences for their ideas. And this goes for leaders on both the liberal and religious ends of the spectrum. How many in more liberal strands of Judaism will assume that death for disobeying is really too much of a price to be paid. Or those on the religious right who may assume that we must fabricate a whole world to separate us from ever coming close to disobeying, which is why the Almighty states regarding his laws that we should not add or take away from them, because the Almighty foresaw in human nature the need for liberals to subtract and the more religious or conservative to add. And friends, another area not spoken of much is the notion of abstract theology. The idea that takes source material such as the Torah and condenses it to such a level that it's not recognizable on the other end. And one huge way we see this is how the world has adopted a belief system that has one man dying for all your sins, past, present, and future. Not to mention that they also teach that this in no way contradicts the standards laid down in Torah. Friends, contrary to this abstract form of thinking, I'm here to tell you that there is an unshakable standard, and anything that deviates from it, from the literal plain understanding of the written law, could never be considered divine. And friends, my hope and the hope of everyone at Torah Judaism International is that through the dissemination of that very standard to the whole world, we can secure a brighter tomorrow for all of us. The same hope we see in this parsha, the hope that kept the father who just saw two of his children died before his eyes, still religious, especially when it was his God that killed him, teaching us that there are some things in life bigger than our children and our families, no matter on how it may hurt us to even think it. When a parent sends his child to defend their country against tyranny, that idea that death is the most valuable currency that could ever be used to purchase something bigger and better, as described in this parsha, that shows Aaron remaining faithful after this tragedy in his life, that this was his sacrifice, laying down the lives of his children toward the building of a belief system that will soon sensitize the whole world. And then we see something very interesting transpire with Aaron failing to perform his priestly duties correctly. His brother Moses actually calls him on it. Aaron looks at Moses and tells him, after all I've sacrificed, after what I've just lost, I'm only human, I'm only a man. And you know what? Moses knew that God understood, teaching us that when you've done so much for the sake of Torah, when you've sacrificed so much for the greater good, and yet it seems that the trials and tough times are never going to end, know that God sees your pain and knows your sacrifice, so don't give up. Are you beginning to see how much is actually stored in this parsha alone? So what was the sin that Nadav and Avihu committed to be executed by the Almighty? The text states that it was a strange fire. Now some think that because following their deaths, the parsha mentions on how one should not serve the Almighty while drunk, that it was probably drunkenness. And at least in regards to drunkenness, anyone who would like to learn more on how this applies to us in our Jewish walk nowadays should really watch my video on how getting drunk on Purim is forbidden. But regardless, we know that it was them replacing his will with theirs, which is identical to what we see mainly coming from movements like Reform today. Why Reform? Because the founders of such movement didn't say that this is what the Almighty is telling us, but that although the Almighty stated this, we're going to do that. And worse, we're going to do it in the name of the Almighty. So friends, today you can be the judge. Whatever group you happen to belong to, if it claims to speak for the God of the Bible, its values cannot contradict the Bible. And then the parsha goes on to describe clean and unclean animals and how we should distinguish between them. And then it goes on to lay down an important principle that what we eat could actually make us holy and clean. And the main reason I feel such an urge to emphasize this point is that this is one of the major disconnects between Christianity and Judaism today, and is actually what gave birth to movements like conservative and reform. Movements that teach that although the Torah may say it's green, it must really mean yellow. Why? Because it just feels right. The idea that eating kosher means eating healthy and Shabbat means any day of the week that you set apart, and that biblical guidelines are not applicable and mean nothing today. And regarding this, Jesus even famously said that it's not what goes into your mouth that makes you unclean, but what comes out, directly going against the Torah he claimed to uphold. Now, I'm aware that the question asked him by the Pharisees had nothing to do with eating, but rather with the washing of the hands. But we see in Jesus' response that he basically destroys the whole Torah notion that not only what one eats, but even what one touches makes him unclean. And I also know that many would say that this is not what Jesus had in mind. But friends, this is what he said, or at least what they wrote. Perhaps if he would have said it's not only what goes in, but what goes out. But he didn't, which eventually got Paul and all of his future followers to abandon the letter of the law for the supposed spirit of it, instead of faithfully upholding both, which is identical to what occurred with the Reform movement's shrimp debacle that eventually made the belief in God optional within the movement, teaching us that the Torah, my friends, is the only solid foundation we could stand on, and that if we don't stand for it, we will fall for anything. Then, friends, the parsha goes on to lay out a concept that has really raised the ethical bar even higher. And what's that? That we're commanded to be holy as the Almighty himself is holy. Kadoshim Tiyu, to the point that the Ramban Nachmanides teaches that someone could keep virtually all of the mitzvahs in the Torah and still be a jerk. In other words, that if everything we do in Torah is not first enveloped within the concept of holiness, then we have really truly accomplished nothing. So like all important areas in life, the answer lies somewhere in between, in not adding or taking away, but in being obedient to what's already there. So friends, if you're hearing me today and you're interested in becoming a Jew yourself and becoming an inheritor to all the blessings in our God's Torah, I want to welcome you to convert to Judaism. For more information on converting to Judaism, please visit Torah Judaism International at torahjudaism.org. And for more information on living a Jewish life, please visit bejewish.org. Thank you.